Okay, I'm turning now to two of our younger researchers, and I'm always delighted to see our younger researchers, and we've got two high flyers who are speaking next. Our first is Dr. Lion Shahab, who's a senior lecturer at the University College London. Thanks, Leon.
Hi. Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me. I apologize for my appearance. I had an altercation with Anne about the fact that I can fit 40 slides in a 15-minute presentation. So I shall try to do my best. Anyhow, I'm going to talk about toxicant and carcinogen exposure in e-cigarette users compared with smokers. The only declaration of interest that is really of interest is that I'm a vapor. So we know there are controversies surrounding the safety claims regarding e-cigarettes. A PhD commission report published by Anne a couple of years ago and concluded there's been an overall shift towards the inaccurate perception of e-cigarettes being as harmful as cigarettes, in contrast to the current expert estimate that using e-cigarettes is around 95% safer than smoking. And the year later, the Royal College of Physicians also had a report substantiating this claim. Now, rather swiftly, there were two editorials that appeared in The Lancet and in the BMJ, which pointed out that there was no hard evidence and that the estimate was based on expert consensus alone. A somewhat unfair description, I would have thought. Anyhow, the media took this to mean that academics are at war about e-cigarette claims. And so the question I'm trying to answer today is the 95% harm reduction claim justifiable and backed up by hard evidence? Before I can get to this, we have to decide what kind of outcome we're going to look at in order to evaluate this. So which outcome to choose? The best one would arguably be actual health outcomes in cohorts. We have got, unfortunately, a couple of problems with that. So these are smoking prevalence rates in the US in the last century for men in red and women in blue. You can see here that they're peaked for men around 1950s and for women about 1960s, and then lung cancer deaths in the US over the same time period for men here and for women here. And what you can see, of course, first thing is that there's quite a long time lag, about 20 to 40 years, between the peak prevalence of smoking and peak prevalence of people dying from lung cancer. Now, if we look at e-cigarette use as a comparator to smoking, these are data from the Smoking Toolkit study run by Robert West and Jeremy Brown at UCL. For the last 10 years, the base here is the total population. E-cigarette prevalence increased quite dramatically in the UK in around 2011 there. But it also means is that we only had about 6 years of exposure so far in the population in cohorts. So really, it's impossible for us to see any kind of long-term effects at the moment because we don't have enough data. A second problem associated with looking at cohorts and actual health outcomes is signified by this study here. This is the 1 million women study published in The Lancet. And you see all-cause mortality among never smokers and current smokers. And the X graph here, you can also see what happens to people who have stopped smoking at various parts in their life. I don't know if this is going to do anything. Yes, there we go. So this is about 25 years of age, this is about 30 years of age, 40 years, and 50 years of age. And what you can see is that as you go along this curve, even if you stop smoking in your 30s, you already have an increased risk of dying prematurely because of your smoking. So smoking-related health effects are irreversible, some of them. And unfortunately, if we look at e-cigarette users in cohorts, the vast majority of those e-cigarette users are, in fact, past or current smokers. So these are data from the UK, again from the Smoking Toolkit study. You can see here, never smokers, the use of e-cigarettes among never smokers is relatively rare, at around 0.4% at the moment. It has been increasing over the last 3 or 4 years among former tobacco users, but the largest proportion of people who use e-cigarettes are still current tobacco users. So the problem is here that we have a vast majority of e-cigarette users who are current or past smokers, and that any kind of health outcomes you would look at would be confounded with past smoking behavior of those users. So looking at actual health outcomes in cohorts is arguably not the best way to go forward. So perhaps we should look at biomarkers of actual harm. The good thing about biomarkers of harm is that the evidence will accumulate much more quickly than if you look at health outcomes. But there are these issues around acute versus chronic effects. So this paper, recently published, for instance, purported to claim that e-cigarettes increase aortic stiffness similar to smoking cigarettes, which is all good and well, except for the fact that the very same authors also published a study showing that if you drink coffee, you increase aortic stiffness, and if you exercise, it increases aortic stiffness, the same effect. So arguably, those two behaviors aren't all that dangerous. So we have to differentiate acute from chronic effects. If you want to look at more chronic effects, one thing we could do, for instance, is to look at DNA adducts, the first step in carcinogenesis. Or we could look at lung function. I'm sure that Ricardo will talk about this in a moment. Now, we know that lung function is the classic Fletcher and Peter curve, is that across a lifespan, lung function declines in non-smokers, so people not susceptible to smoke, compared with smokers, see in red, where lung function declines much more rapidly, leading to premature death. The problem, though, with DNA adducts is that these also may persist for decades after exposure again, and that when somebody stops smoking, their lung function doesn't go back to that of a non-smoker, it just stops declining quite so rapidly. So really, effects may be long-lasting and confounded with past smoking, and so therefore I think looking at biomarkers of actual harm to evaluate a reduced risk claim is problematic. So then that's why I would suggest looking at biomarkers of exposure of risk, and because, first of all, evidence accumulates much more quickly, secondly, because they're short-term and reversible. But of course, you have to be very careful in the selection of these biomarkers, because they have to be reasonably specific to the behavior and also linked to a disease. So the biomarkers for this study that I'm going to look at include NNAL, which is a marker for nitrosamines, NNK in particular, which is a potent lung carcinogen. It's very specific to tobacco use and has been linked to subsequent cancer risk. It has a urinary half-life of about 10 days, which means that it should be eliminated within a month from your body. The second one I'm going to look at is 1-hydroxypyrene, which is a marker for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Again, these are very potent carcinogens. They're relatively specific to tobacco use, not entirely, so they're also environmental sources of pyrene exposure, for instance, and they're linked to subsequent cancer risk again, and the urinary half-life is about 20 hours. The third one I'm going to look at is called 3-HPMA, which is a marker of acrolein, which is a potent respiratory irritant. And again, it's relatively specific to tobacco use, but can also be caused by other environmental exposures, including, for instance, burned foods and things like that. And as Ed just pointed out, aldehydes, of course, have been linked to cancer. So acrolein is one of the aldehydes there. And the urinary half-life is about 1 day. And the last biomarker I'm going to look at is carbon monoxide. We know that carbon monoxide is highly toxic. Carbon monoxide poisoning is not that uncommon. But for simplicity, I will only look at exhaled carbon monoxide readings here. And again, carbon monoxide is relatively specific to tobacco use. It's not entirely only because of tobacco use. Can also get, again, environmental exposure. If you exercise, you have higher carbon monoxide readings. And it has been linked to cardiovascular disease subsequently. There's a half-life of about 5 hours. So these are the biomarkers I'm going to look at. Now the question is, which kind of design are we going to look at in order to answer that question? I would argue we should look at humans, not animals. And this is because, among other things, great failure to replicate animal studies. So I looked into this, because I also did some research in Alzheimer's, where we have failed to replicate most of the drugs that have been successful in animal studies in humans, and the same is true, for instance, for cancer trials. About 8% of the drugs that go forward actually are successful in the transition from animal to humans. I would also suggest to look at body level exposure because machine yields are deceptive. So what happens in the aerosol? Because the device and the user interact, and that determines the exposure. So one unfortunate example from tobacco control community is, of course, the rise of the light cigarette, where perforation holes were put into the filters of cigarettes, which people then summarily obviously covered up and smoked very hardly on, whereas when you look at the machines that tested the exposure in users, the holes are outside, basically saying that there was a reduction in risk, and in fact that wasn't the case. And the inverse has been obviously observed for e-cigarettes. This study already mentioned, which showed much higher levels of formaldehyde in e-cigarette users, but only when their e-cigarettes are used at high voltage, when of course most e-cigarette users wouldn't dream of using it at that level. So that probably overestimated exposure. And I'm only going to look at EC-only users because, not dual users, because, again, to avoid confounding with past smoking. And then lastly, it's very important to consider the appropriate comparator here, which should be smokers, not never smokers. This is because the claim is about reduced risk compared with smokers, 95% reduction. Secondly, because I already mentioned, most e-cigarette users are current or past smokers, and arguably also it's much more important and informative for population impact. So I know that David Levy is in the audience, and one of his papers recently published looked at this and suggested, for instance, if you have a 95% risk reduction, we can avoid 6.6 million deaths in the USA alone over the next 10 years. But even if the reduction is only 6%, you can expect 1.6 million fewer deaths. So it's important to have that information of risk reduction in order to inform these modeling studies. Now, coming to the findings, finally. The first one, I'm going to look at NNAL. I found 10 published studies on 10 published papers on 8 studies with about 658 participants published in the last 2 years. And they mostly evaluated second and third generation e-cigarettes. The next couple of slides are going to look very similar. So here you have the percent reduction compared with cigarettes. So this is your benchmark. So these are all the cigarette users in the studies. And then we have studies ordered from the length of use of e-cigarettes and abstinence from smoking, from lowest lengths with about a couple of days usually to the longest length, which is about a couple of years even. And then there's a weighted average at the end. There are different types of studies that I found. Some of them were RCTs, so not randomized controlled trials. Some of them were switching studies where somebody comes in, is a cigarette smoker, and then is asked to switch over either within the lab or with an ambulatory setting to switch over to an e-cigarettes. And so they are compared with their own baseline, as it were, from their smoking days to their then having switched over e-cigarette days. And then cross-sectional studies where people are taken from the general population, either e-cigarette users naturally or smokers, and compared. And then also historic comparisons where you compare e-cigarette users now with data from smokers from a couple of years ago. And these are the results that I could find. So for NNAL, you see some studies that show reductions in the exposure around 60 to 70%. And then some of the other studies, especially as we come along, they're more long-term, the studies, reduction are much greater. And so the overall weighted average, this is weighted for the number of participants in these studies, shows you that the reduction is about 91.4%, which is pretty close to the PHE estimate you will please see here. And in fact, there's some confounding going on here because these 3 studies, people were only searched over for about 2 weeks. So we would expect residual levels of NNAL to be present still. And so if we remove this and just focus on the longer term studies of at least a month, the estimate is 96.4%. So far, so good. Then it changes. So now I'm going to look at one hop. So this is an exposure for exposure of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. There were 4 published studies, 3 studies and 4 published papers in the last 3 years with about 270 participants in it. And what we see here is the first study finds a reduction of about 70%. The second, a reduction of a mere 4.1%. And the last is a historic comparison, 60.4%, giving a weighted average reduction of 57.6%, obviously somewhat higher than what would expect it based on the PHE report. I should, however, point out that in this study, Gorniewicz study, a fair number of those people weren't actually adherent to the protocols. They are probably dual users, so we should exclude that study, which brings it down a bit. So the risk reduction is about 62%. Then looking at 3-HPMA as a marker of aldehydes, there were 8 published studies with 8 published papers with 7 studies over the last 2 years with 658 participants. And this is what I could find is quite varied across these fields and doesn't appear to be related with the length of abstinence, because these are the furthest here are longer. So the Hecht paper shows a 75% reduction. Our paper that was published this year find only 41% reduction. It's entirely clear why. However, the overall weighted average suggests there's a reduction of 60% compared with smokers. So these are always the smokers' levels, which are 100%, obviously. So again, this is somewhat higher than the PHE estimate. And then lastly, carbon monoxide. There were 9 published papers that fulfilled the criteria I applied of 8 studies, reporting 8 studies with 245 participants, and these are mostly first and second generation e-cigarettes that were evaluated here, I should point out, because they're somewhat older. And there were also some studies I include here which are crossover trials, so where people use one product and then switch over to another product, and there's some washout period in between. And what we see is a reduction of between 60 to nearly 90% in carbon monoxide levels. And some of these are after people have been abstinent, claimed to be abstinent from smoking for a long period of time, just using e-cigarettes. So again, the weighted average here was around 80%, 78%. Again, somewhat higher than the PHA, somewhat lower than the PHE estimate. So, is the 95% claim justified? Well, I would say yes, if you look at the most specific and best characterized toxicant carcinogen there is in relation to tobacco use, which is NNAL. Not quite if you look at some of the other biomarkers, but these are less specific, and they are arguably less well characterized in terms of the relation to tobacco use, in particular 1-hop-3-HPMA and carbon monoxide. And that would suggest a risk reduction of about 60 to 80% if you look at those biomarkers, which I think, it's important to point out, would still yield net benefit population level according to the Levy data. However, I should point out, of course, that as I mentioned, those 3 biomarkers have also other not only endogenous but also exogenous sources of exposure. So really, we ought to look at the few studies that also included non-smokers to see whether any kind of background level of exposure could explain these kind of lower reductions that we see here. And so here I've listed again the studies according to whether they looked at 1-hop, 3-HPMA, or carbon monoxide, which also include non-smokers in their study samples. And these are the data for the e-cigarette users, okay, which I reported already, and these are the data for the non-smokers. What you can see actually, except for our study, put out, virtually all of them are identical. So based on that, we see similar reductions to non-smokers and e-cigarette users on these 3 biomarkers. So if you are prepared to say that not smoking is around 95% safer than smoking, it's likely to be the case for e-cigarette use as well, based on these biomarkers at least. But I would take a step back and would say I wouldn't want to pin myself to 95% reduction claims, but just say, based on the best available evidence, e-cigarettes are likely much safer, orders of magnitude safer than cigarettes. And just lastly, I just want to point out some caveats, though, important to remember. These kind of studies, of course, only looked at a limited number of biomarkers here. There might be other more relevant ones that should be looked at. And it's also quite unclear whether there are always linear or threshold effects that we should consider. So, for instance, is a 95% reduction in exposure equivalent to 95% reduction in harm? We can't know for all of these. And there may also be unknown harms due to, among other things, the mode of delivery. So if you have a lot of evidence that nicotine, if it's delivered via buccal or dermal absorption, is pretty safe. Nobody would argue with that. For inhalation, we have less information. Also, there may be unknown pathways. Some people have argued, for instance, that propylene glycol may lead to carcinogenic propylene oxide exposure. And then, of course, you have changing patterns of use. Cloud chasing, as Ed was pointing out, may increase the risk, and changing products. So we may never know the exact level of harm reduction of e-cigarettes use compared with smoking. If I had unlimited time and money, obviously I have limited time because I've run over now, I'm so sorry, I would suggest comparing disease incidence in cohorts of never smokers with long-term e-cigarette use and long-term smokers in order to answer this question accurately. Thank you very much.